First of all, of course, Europe could have stopped this, but it would have taken, at a minimum, it would have taken France, Germany, and Italy, the leaders, all of whom, by the way, early this year were on the same track that there was a way to either prevent the war or stop the war, but acting together, which they did not do. And they were unwilling to stand up to the US on that. But I think another interesting observation in how the US kind of batted Macron aside, Scholz aside, Draghi aside in the first months of this year is an observation that I heard from another European leader, which I think is pretty astute, which is that, look, the US has moved on. The real front line of US foreign policy is not Western Europe. The real front line really is the Baltic states, is Poland, is Ukraine. They rather like that fact. That is the more eastern countries. Now they're really something. They're big in the U.S. Imperial view, and somehow this is even more disheartening uh, to Western Europe. But the fact of the matter is, I actually have no doubt in my mind, having been around for 40 years with these processes, that if the European leaders had said clearly, privately, publicly, any which way to Biden, no, this is not right, and we don't want this war, and we've got to do this a different way, and you've got to sit down with Putin because that's what this is really about, and he's laid out a basis for sitting down, it would have happened. Because the US could not resist that, actually. So who bluffed whom, or who said wait, or who said don't worry, hard to know. But the Europeans lost the chance, and Brussels, of course, is useless in this. That's part of the problem. Uh, Brussels has been useless and completely on side. And your country, Alexander, is just so excited to be fighting the Second Crimean War. They can't even contain themselves. Palmerston didn't get his way in 1856, so we're going to get our way in 2022. It's almost a joy for them. Terrible to say.
Sadly, very true. Do you have time for one more question from me?
Of course.
So it's about the fact that to my mind, all the Brzezinski plans, all these grand chess games, which ignore the people, because if you treat countries as pieces on a chessboard or squares on a chessboard, you're already going, I think, seriously wrong. But it's so 20th century. It's so part of the world in a way that existed in the first half of the 20th century. It didn't end well, by the way. There is now another world beyond Europe. We have you were in Bali. You saw all of these other countries now asserting themselves. Um, we're fighting. It also seems to me we not only created a disaster. It's a disaster fighting battles left over from 170 years ago, which have lost their meaning now, or at least that's so it seems to me.
Hey, Jeffrey, are you familiar with the structural financial crisis theory developed by the Russian economist Mikhail Kazin in the last 20 years? He predicted the globalist world split into currency zones or blocks.
I'm not familiar with the theory. I apologize, but I would say the following about blocks and currency zones. First, we shouldn't want them. So again, I don't tend to believe in deterministic outcomes. I believe that we have choices, though we often make very bad ones. Second, specifically on currency blocks, it's a pretty interesting point and very relevant for us. The U.S. At the beginning of the war said that cutting Russia off from SWIFT was the so-called nuclear option. Aside from the horror of the use of that term in this context anyway, the fact is that it proved to be pretty non-consequential. And the reason is actually quite basic. And I said so, by the way, to the US government at the time. Don't count on your sanctions having so much effect. Nothing much is going to happen. They don't work the way you think, and so forth. It was pretty obvious. But there are many ways to transact. You do not have to go through a US bank, US dollar, and SWIFT. Bottom line. And you can go through yuan, you can go through rupees, you can go through rubles. There are lots of ways to transact. When we teach monetary economics, as I have at Harvard and Columbia for 40 years, you say money's a veil. In other words, it's not the real economy. It facilitates the economy. And the idea that the dollar is the irreplaceable, indispensable currency, and so that's America's real hold on global power. All that the United States is doing is dramatically accelerating the end of the dollar special prerogatives and privileges, because frankly, if you're not getting along with the United States geopolitically, do not hold dollar reserves. They're going to be grabbed, whether you're Venezuela or Iran or Russia or some other country. And so there are other ways to hold reserves and to settle payments, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Danielle says, what future role do you see for the United Nations? Will it be able to be reformed to be more representative of sovereign states and people of the world, and out of pocket of the United States and interest groups?
You know, I spend most of every day for the last 22 years trying to help the UN. And I have to tell you, I haven't been paid. They owe me $22 because I do it $1 a year every year. I haven't seen my dollars yet, but I am a believer in the United Nations, though it's easy to be mocked for that. I think the UN was one of the great visions by our greatest president, who really was a great man, Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think that of too many of our presidents, but he really was a great man, and he had a great vision, which was that there could be a UN. Of course, it's flawed in many ways, but it's also completely essential. If we turn away from war and peace, we really do have a climate crisis. That's another discussion that has engaged me almost all my career in life, and it's very real. And now, of course, we don't pay attention to it in the midst of all of this mess. But the point is, as hard as it is to do anything in this world today, you can't do it actually without global cooperation. And to have global cooperation, you need institutions, and you end up with a UN. So if we didn't have it, we'd invent it. Then we would find out how damn hard global cooperation is, for all the obvious reasons. First of all, politicians have their power base, and if they are democracies, their electoral base at home. And so that is the starting point, which is it's not easy to get the cooperation. But also all the points we've been talking about of the kind of delusions of grandeur of the neocons and so forth impedes it as well. So my answer is it's a long talk. It would help me to explain why I've spent 22 years virtually nonstop trying to help the UN. I believe in it. I believe it's absolutely essential. Incidentally, all these, the charge that the US makes about the UN, for example, can't go to the UN Security Council because of the veto. The fact of the matter is the veto has been not a bad thing, actually. If the United States had listened to many of those vetoes, it would have avoided multiple disasters. When Russia and China vetoed the Iraq war in 2003, that wasn't anti-US. That was just sanity. And if the United States had said, maybe we should reconsider, we would have saved several $trillion and a lot of global grief. So even whatever one thinks about the veto, it says something when major powers say, I don't agree, they should talk to each other. Of course, what's happened specifically with the Security Council is it's become no more than a theater for sound bites. They don't deliberate. They don't analyze things. They just give speeches. It's really degraded in its actual operation, because if the Security Council actually studied any of the problems it's grappling with, really looked at the evidence honestly, brought in outside expertise, these problems are solvable. And I often think, if I might, since I work a lot with the Vatican also, they have a very good idea when they elect a new pope. As you know, they lock the cardinals in the room. And I've thought that we probably could end the Ukraine war peacefully if the Security Council was put in the chambers, the door was locked, conclave, and they were told, you don't come out until the white smoke appears above the 38th floor. They could actually solve this. And of course, they don't do that. They want the sound bites for the news cycle. They're not actually talking with each other.
Well said. Two more?
Of
Two more
course.
questions? Awesome. Awesome. Thank you very much. Commander Crossfire asks, does Russia's political system allow for a strong leader to follow Putin, or does it stifle strong ambition? What is the shape of the Russian deep state, and what is the future of the post-Soviet state or the neo-union?
Such easy questions. We should have stopped before. The only thing I would say, and I don't know the answers to those questions, but the only thing I would say is one of the things I've observed in advising governments in well over 100 countries over the last 40 years is how deep political cultures are. Political cultures are much deeper than economic structures or technologies and so forth. I really believe that if you look at Xi Jinping, you can see a Han Emperor there as well. And not surprisingly, because it was really in about 200 BC that China formed a centralized administrative state. It's in many ways brilliant statecraft, arguably the most successful statecraft on average over 2,000 years. And the current state, though it's a completely different political structure in the People's Republic, looks a lot like the China's centralized administrative state. I would say, I don't know if you two as real experts would agree with me, but when I look at President Putin, I see a czar because the political culture is similar. It's not surprising. This is hundreds of years. It's deep. It came for reasons, by the way. There's history to it. And I think we should understand this, by the way. This is why the finger pointing and so forth about, your regime is illegitimate, yours is this, yours is that. That's fundamentally, profoundly naive and mistaken, because these political cultures are quite deep. China's not going to look like the U.S. system. The U.S. system has its own roots. Part of it is a debacle, by the way. Part of it is very good, but it comes out of a cultural matrix. And so I would expect Russia in the future to look like Russia in the past in political culture. I don't bemoan that, by the way, because there are lots of ways to meet public needs and public goods. There's not just one model. And the more you live and the more you know your own society and how flawed it is, the more you look also to other countries and examples to understand maybe there's some better ways to do some of these things. And that's why I, insist on U.S.-China dialogue, why I'm hosting symposia to bring together ancient Greek and ancient Chinese knowledge and so forth. This stuff is good that we talk to each other and that we understand political culture as a real thing and not as a ranking, as is so much done, and especially as a cookie cutter, that there's one way to do this and that's how it's going to be done. That view is part of the naivete and arrogance that gets us into so many problems.